like the luckiest girl in the world right now.
Wow.
Because this is my first time at Ake Arts and Book Festival, and this is my first time I get to do a book chat with one of my favorite authors, Tendai Uchu. I remember when we had that chat and we were just talking about movies and everything. We have so much in common, but you know, we'll talk later, don't worry. Thank you for also teaching me how to pronounce Edinburgh, because I was saying Edinburgh. So he said it's Edinburgh, it's like bra. All right, so let's get started because I know our time is going, and if they left us, we'll just be talking and talking and talking. Okay, so I remember when we first met via email, you said that the last time you came to Nigeria, you didn't get to move around much. So now that you're here for the next 3 days, what do you actually hope to get out of the Nigerian experience as regards food, music, arts, and culture?
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. It's good to be back after 6 years, and thank you for having me back, Lola. It was also cool to see. I know how difficult these things are to organize, so it was cool to see before you started this that there was a therapy thing that you were doing with other festival directors. So, yeah. But being here, I mean, the thing that I remember the most the last time I came around was the food. And the food's still on point. Some can see I didn't even have this belly before I came. Yeah. Apart from that, the company's been all right as well. I'm one of those people that thinks there's too many Kenyans about, but it's fine. Apart from that, but yeah, I'm just going to be visiting a few spots. Yesterday I went to a few places in Lagos, and that was good as well. So I haven't been caged up in the hotel.
That's nice. Okay, so I didn't buy this book specifically for Ake, just so you know. I actually wore it to kind of represent the character Ropa in one of Tendai Uchu's books in the Edinburgh Night series, Library of the Dead and Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments. She has green hair, so I... Thank you, E for effort.
When the Nollywood version comes out.
I have to be inside. I have to be inside. Okay, so your body of work, which is what we're here to talk about today, all the books you've literally written, is quite interesting. So I remember in 2010, Hairdresser of Harare came out, and it was about basically two hairdressers, Vimbai and Dumisani. Then we had the Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician. Quite a title, so I would like to say MMM, which revolves around three Zimbabwean men who fled the Mugabe regime to Edinburgh. Edinburgh. Now we have the Edinburgh Night series, which is literally fiction, and now how does this shift actually help you express yourself in writing?
Okay, so I've never quite viewed it as a shift myself. The way I've always sort of like worked is when I embark on a story or a novel, one of the first questions I ask myself is, what's the best form for this thing to take? So you're not constantly reinventing the wheel. There are these pre-existing narratological conventions that you can use as a vehicle to push the story forward. So the reader comes in knowing what to expect. So if we start with, you know, a brooding man with a bottle of whiskey in an office and a glass, set there, and some beautiful woman walks into the room, we almost know 9 times out of 10 that this is going to be a noir novel, something someone like Leia Denle would write. So when I did The Hairdresser of Harare, I was playing with the genre conventions of chick lit, which was hot at the time. I think people took it a little more seriously because I'm a man, right? So, but I was writing about women in a salon and doing hair and that kind of thing. But then it was like, oh yeah, this guy, okay, so he can't be romance because he's got dreadlocks. He must be a serious guy. That's what I had at the time. So we'll say he's a literary writer. When I did The Maestro, the Magistrate, and the Mathematician, it was my take on the genre spy novel. So it's a spy novel that tries to disguise itself as a literary novel. So these forms are things that I like to play with. Once I have the form of the work, I can then start creating. Before I nail that down, there's something that I'm working on at the moment that, even though I'm like 50,000 words in, it doesn't feel right, and I think it's because I'm trying to force it into a shape that it's not meant to be. So I'll probably have to go back to the drawing board and find out, like, okay, what's the best genre convention I can use to convey this particular story? So that's kind of the reason why I do it, but I can understand when people say, okay, you've changed, you've moved into this other thing, and that's also part of the iceberg theory, the fact that people only see what's at the tip of the iceberg. They don't see the experimentation and all the stuff that's churning underneath, especially the bits that don't work, that never even make it to print, and there's a lot of that stuff. We just don't like to admit it because, you know, you want to be that fabulous writer who kind of nails it all the time. So initially when I was thinking of my writing practice, I thought, okay, so literary fiction will get me working a little bit heavier with character work. I took SFF as a place where I could explore world building and scene setting and that kind of thing. And I took crime as an area where I could work on my plotting skills. So that was for my own practice. But over time, all that stuff blends. So whatever you get, regardless, I've now got a bag of tricks that I can rely on when I craft the next work. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. So when you're crafting the next work, do you actually think about how your readers would react?
How the readers would react?
Yeah, because they're used to, oh, I've read Hedges of Harari, I'm sure it's going to bring out something similar, and then you just bring out Library of the Dead where you're removing intestines and all that. So like, how did you think people were going to react to this, to Edinburgh Night series?
Well, for me, I think readers are pretty gregarious. I mean, most of the people that I know who enjoy novels, they don't just stick to one particular genre or one particular thing. They hope about a lot. But the publishing industry works differently because it's, you know, from this side, we like to say we're pure artists, right? I just do art. I don't care about any of that. But there's someone who's putting their money into creating a product that they sell to the market. So if I bought a John Grisham novel, I would be sorely disappointed if it turned out to be a space opera. I want a fine legal thriller. I know what I'm getting. So I remember after I'd done The Hairdresser of Harare, and I did the second novel, I was taken to lunch with my publisher at Freight Books. And yeah, I was still in that starving artist phase, so it was good to get a free meal. And so I'm sat there wolfing this stuff down, and my editor goes, you know, I'm preparing to hear this praise, you know, about my, you know, unfathomable genius and how great this thing that I've submitted to them is. And my publisher goes, you know, Tendai, readers will only give you a certain range. We were doing really well with this hairdresser thing, but we think this is too much of a diversion. So I'm almost choking on this beef stroganoff. But I'm still gonna eat it because it was a high-priced restaurant that I was in. Yeah, and at the time, they didn't go with me. I actually got dumped because they felt like, yeah, whatever I was doing wasn't going to work. But it was also at that point that I realized, like, look, I have to double down on this thing where I start showcasing stuff that's distinctly different so that I'm not kind of pigeonholed into trying to do this one thing over and over again, because that can be a pain. And I know several of my peers that have kind of struggled with those kind of issues when they've tried to move. But thinking about the African lit scene on its own, sort of like in isolation, I find that there's a lot of writers that do that genre crossing thing. Bryony Ream, This September Sun, a fine kind of genre bending literary novel, her second novel was a crime novel, and that seemed to be fine. Leia Denle, who's here, kind of wrote a fantastic sci-fi novel, which I thought he was trying to muscle into our space. But there is this Tony Khan as well, literary fiction, did crime with Carnivorous City. So there's all these things that are going on if we allow them to happen. But I can't come from sort of like the naive artist point and say, I don't get where the publishers are coming from when they say this doesn't particularly work for us. And that's why you find my lit work is published as Tendai Huchu, and I do this other stuff as Tiao Huchu, so you don't get Marmite when you want Nutella.
I'll note that down. So in The Hairdresser of Harare, you talk about gender roles, and a particular quote comes to mind. So it goes, a male hairdresser, who'd ever heard of such a thing? Why did you decide to craft a character that follows the popular stereotype of gay men being feminine?
This one wants to get me canceled. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Again, one of the things that I do in my own work, and we're all told, anyone who's been to a creative writing workshop is told, avoid cliches, yeah. Right? I come at it from the opposite end of the spectrum, where I actually actively embrace cliches and try to rework them. I think some of these conventions are shorthands that work for a certain reason. So the reason I had Doobie as a hairdresser and he was gay is I knew the reader would expect that. But then you have Wimbai, on the other hand, who completely doesn't see this. But it also functioned on the basis that this is a Western trope that we've now adopted. So Wimbai, who's Zimbabwean, wouldn't necessarily think in that sense. But I wanted the reader to know right from the start that this is who this guy was. And I'm a fan of Columbo. Has anyone watched that? Are there any Columbo fans? Yeah. I mean, Columbo pretty much overturns the detective genre, right? Your usual mystery flick starts with, say there's a murder and we see a body and the detective comes in and they kind of have to interview the suspects and figure out who's done it. In Columbo, you see who does it. The murderer appears, you know exactly who they are. And then the detective comes in and he starts doing the work. So you are ahead of Columbo. But you see his interactions with the actual murderer. And you certainly hope it works for certain readers that get exactly what it is you're doing. But now in the library of sort of The Dead and Our Lady and this series that I'm working on, you'll find that even the sentences that I use, Ropa, the main character, uses an awful lot of cliches. Like, if I can find a cliche, I will throw it in there. And that's just kind of my reaction to this other thing that says you're not supposed to do that.
That's great. I don't know why, maybe it was only me that thought it was going to be a romance novel and they were going to fall in love, which obviously did not happen, so that's fine. Okay, so still on the hairdresser of Harare, Dumisani and Vimbai are rivals in Mrs. Kumalo's salon. For Vimbai, she actually believes that whiteness is a state of mind, and for her, her client should leave the salon feeling like white women. But Dumisani, on the other hand, makes women feel more like themselves. So is this rivalry reflective of the struggles that Africans have in pandering towards Eurocentric beauty standards?
Yeah. In short, I think you pretty much got what's going on there. There is, and we can't escape these Eurocentric beauty standards because they're blasted at you 24/7 virtually that tell you you have to look a certain way, even if it doesn't fit. And then occasionally they might, particularly if you live in the West, take one black person and say, okay, so we've got this one that's also beautiful. You know, it's Idris Elba and no one else. But I wanted these two hairdressers to, you know, I was playing with really simple binaries that you can read on the surface. Rimbai, female, straight, Christian, conservative. Yeah, that's the contradiction, and that's the bit in which she's imperfect, because you always have to have, sorry, you might not have heard that, but TK mentioned that Wimbai was a single mother. But I was thinking, as you craft a character, there always has to be some kind of quote-unquote flawed. Now, this is not me saying, go and tweet and say, Tendai, would you say single mothers are flawed? But in Wimbai's worldview, with how she perceives herself and her upbringing, this is a flaw. So there's always that difference between the author's perspective and the character's perspective. And whenever there's a clash like that, you always go with how the character sees the world. I find in being edited, and I'm, again, one of those writers that really enjoys being edited and working with an editor in fine-tuning the work afterwards. And usually where you find the most problems, it's because you've kind of tried to insert your own worldview, something that doesn't fit your character. But I forget what we're talking about.
We're talking about the rivalry between Dumisani and Bimbai, and if it's reflective of the struggles that Africans have in pandering towards Eurocentric beauty standards. You know, the long hair, the wigs, they look like Beyonce, or no, not Beyonce, Beyonce is black, sorry, but look like Mariah Carey, you know, and all that.
Oh yeah, and that's why the title is the hairdresser of Ferrari. So you as the reader get to pick which one of the two you root for, if anyone at all.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to your new series, the Edinburgh Night series. So in this series, you write about magic from a scientific viewpoint. You reference scientists like Thompson that says that magic is the result of centuries of progressive scientific refinement. So why have you decided to take the spirituality out of magic? Because for me, when I read most of these books, I see a lot of, oh, it came from one ancestor, our gods, this, our gods. I go to a temple to worship. I have to keep doing that to get the powers and all. But yours, you took the spirituality out of it. I didn't really see much of that there. So, and I want to know why you decided to relate it to science.
Okay, so the magic as a science thing has been going on for a very long time. I'm certainly not the one who invented it, and there's a famous author's son who might, you know, accuse me of pinching stuff from his dad if I'm not careful. But what you do when you have that, okay, so when you do a magic system, one of the questions that you've got to ask yourself is what is possible and what's impossible, because with softer magic systems, one of the difficulties that you encounter is there will always be moments in which the reader says, well, they did that, but how come they can't magic their way out of this particular situation? And that becomes a problem. So you almost need to create a kind of straitjacket for yourself, or at least a set of rules which the reader knows, and then through working in that framework, there's a certain kind of logical consistency to what's going on. Scientific magic in itself, which is what the magic and the Library of the Dead is called, is an oxymoron, right? You've got science and magic, and the two are at polar opposites, because as soon as it becomes something that's explicable by as scientific logic, something empirical, it stops being a mystery. It's no longer magical. And you see that kind of in the growth of different professions. If you think about how healing gradually morphed into medicine, right? So you no longer have that mysticism, at least if you go to like a mainstream kind of hospital, then you no longer have that mysticism attached to it. And so if magic was a thing in the real world, there would end up being that same kind of rationalization, because it would turn into a profession. So it would be something fairly mundane, at least in my view. The way I sort of look at it, it's think about literature now and some of the papers that come out where they say, oh, we put someone in an MRI scan and we proved that reading a novel can light up the empathetic parts of the brain. Therefore, novels are good because we have the scientific basis for it, right? Because as with anything, if you have, we live in this world where there is a constant competition for funding, particularly in academic spaces, where the hard sciences are at the top, your STEM stuff, and the humanities are at the bottom. So there's now that need to kind of rationalize the stuff to say, oh, but we have the science to tell you it creates a better society because we've put people in MRI scanners that have shown this, which I think is a lot of bollocks because I'm in this for the fun as well. It's enough for me that this thing that we do is enjoyable and meaningful, and that for me, minus all these other rationalizations that we add into it, I think that for me is enough. And I also come at it from the perspective that if this thing, which is a trivial thing, I mean, if I fuck up in my novel, no one's going to die. If a farmer messes up, people are going to starve, right? So there's like real world consequences. But for me, that triviality of what it is I do actually makes it more meaningful because therefore it's something that I choose to do as opposed to something that has to be done for some kind of good that you can explain away easily. Yeah.
So in this series, you actually play with the concept of astral travel. And you create a world known as the Ever There, where ghosts that have unfinished business stay before they move on to the afterlife. Now, it is commonly believed, it's not me that said it, it is commonly believed that an aspect of a writer's belief always slips into his work. So are you someone that believes in astral travel? And do you think there's a place like the Ever There?
I suppose aspects of you sip into the work. I was sort of raised in a conservative Catholic setup where, the belief in an afterlife, that's all part of the package. My own journey through life has led me towards a very kind of, not a militant atheism of the Dawkins sort, but the belief that this reality is the only one that's there. And for me, it actually means this reality is much, much more special because we're here for, that's all we get. And you don't get to do it over, you don't get to come back again and again. There isn't like some other plane that you are sent to. Therefore, what you do here is actually meaningful because this is it, right? But for this book, what am I doing when I introduce the concept of ghosts? For me, ghosts are like really interesting. Again, because of that Catholic background, I'm a wimp. I can't do horror films. Like if you got me to watch something like The Exorcist or something with, I can't do spooky horror. If you give me like vampires or zombies, stuff that I can see, I'm okay with that.
That is very strange because have you read your book? It is spooky.
Yeah, but we're human, we have these contradictions. So the stuff that's supernatural, if I watch that and go to bed and something creaks, I'm jumping out of bed and turning the light on. Right? That's what I do. But what are we talking about when we talk about ghosts? I think they represent something. You can use them, certainly, for those spooky jump scares, just to have something that freaks the reader out. But they also speak to unresolved issues. So whenever there is a ghost story and a ghost comes along, it wants something from the living. It's like, okay, I've been murdered and now you've got to find my murderer, or there was some offense that was done to it. It needs something done so it can rest. And I think one series that kind of played around with this in a way that you can see so well and viscerally is Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House. I don't know if anyone's watched it, but the ghosts in that particular series, they all, at least they've been explained as metaphors for the 5 stages of grief or something like that. And in the series that I'm crafting, there's a lot of history to do with the Scottish Enlightenment and all that stuff. You know, some of which you might have heard about during the first panel that was on this morning. And what I wanted to do was to bring some of these ideas from this period that really shaped the world that we live in such a violent but profound way. So for anyone who might not have an idea, the Scottish Enlightenment is this weird period. So if you were in for the first talk that happened today, you heard about this union between, you know, empire creating Britain or the UK, right? So Scotland joins in the Union in 1707 because they tried to do a colonial thing in Panama that went disastrously wrong. This is in the second novel, Our Lady of Mysterious Ailments. They had a mission over to Panama, they raised a lot of money for it, and it pretty much bankrupted the nation. And they were stuck. And the only way out for the aristocrats who pumped in most of the money, I mean, was to get into a union with England, and England would pick up some of the debts that Scotland had notched up. So in return, they lost their parliament and they kind of got absorbed into this English thing, and then they got all these perks of running sort of colonies in the Caribbean and stuff like that. And they made a lot of money. So when you come to Edinburgh, which is the city where I live in, it's this quaint touristy place that's, you know, it's these old, beautiful buildings. But when you know the history of how some of this stuff was built, the Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, which is where my Society of Magicians are actually housed. They have some kind of link with the Royal Bank of Scotland. The Royal Bank of Scotland only emerges I think in 1723, because it was one of the mechanisms for the Scots to get compensation for this colonial project that they had failed from the English. And up till today, that bank is still there, even though it's been kind of folded into NatWest and stuff, but it actually grew for 300 years. I think along the way, it absorbed another 300 or so odd banks, so it's this hybrid chimera. The city, the new town of the city, which is kind of as this neoclassical architectures and these grand buildings, was built with funding from this bank. Some of the houses, there's an interesting lady from Grenada called Lisa Williams who does Black History walks in Edinburgh. And if you walk with her, she'll tell you, okay, this building was because during the abolition of slavery, the slave owner or the plantation owner got compensation for loss of his human property, and he used it to build this wonderful building that you have here. You know, all that sugar stuff that you listened to earlier on, that is right there in the architecture of the city. But what I want to do as a fantasy writer is to tell some of this history by actually bringing through certain historical figures that were part of the Enlightenment. So you had all these ideas about race, which were refined during the Enlightenment. And those are things that will come up as the series begins to progress. But beyond that, I mean, there's other ghosts that I use that come in for very trivial stuff, like one just wants to pass on a baking recipe to her grandson before she passes. So you have that mix between the grand historical and kind of like the mundane stuff, which is how we live. Yeah.
So I want to move on to my favorite character, obviously Roper, because I would not be like this if I didn't like Roper. So Roper, who is actually just 14, drops out of school to become a ghost talker. And she goes in and out of internship so she can fund her sister's school fees and take care of her grandmother who is ill. So I just want to ask you a question first before I ask my main question. Are you the firstborn?
Nah, I'm in the middle.
You say it like that, nah, like you don't want to be.
Who wants that level of responsibility?
Okay.
You have to pick your birthday order wisely, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you think the expectations that are actually placed on firstborn, especially when they are children, or unrealistic?
I suppose we could start by even asking, what is childhood? Because our conception of childhood right now is historically a fairly recent thing. So I trained as a podiatrist, a foot specialist. No foot fetish jokes from me, please. I've had enough of those in my lifetime. But this is what I trained in. And as I was training, a lot of your client groups, the people that have problems with their feet, are old people. So they sit in your chair and you're sorting out their corns and colors and all that. And they tell you their life stories. And this is in Edinburgh. And I met a lot of people that would tell you, I went off to work at the age of 14. They were helping support the family. They were working in factories. They were doing jobs. And this is kind of in living memory. But if we think about the way the world is set up now, the clothes that you are wearing might have been made by some kid working in a sweatshop. This whole idea that kids don't work is, I mean, if your society can support that, it's cool. But in other parts of the world, families rely on people that would consider to be kids to work, whereas elsewhere you might get away with being a teenager until you're in your mid-30s. That's kind of the way it is. So what I did with the character of Ropa, the reason I give a lot of these responsibilities, I mean, part of it is just that thing that you do with young characters, right? You need your young character to go off on adventures. Therefore, they become an orphan. You kill off the parents. And you see that replicated so many times in literature. And now they're free because there's things Ropa does that if her parents were there, they'll just tell her, go to bed. You know, these fantasies of talking to ghosts and solving their problems, you're not getting out of the house, young lady. So she's free to do this stuff and move about the city. But I was also thinking about the Edinburgh that I built is, some people have called it dystopian, but all I did was kind of blend Edinburgh in with elements of its own history. So by doing that, I can now have kids like Ropa working and stuff and taking on responsibilities that we wouldn't, ideally, if you can afford it, give to a kid of her age if she was your own child.
So still on your characters, aside the maestro, magistrate, and the mathematician, you have strong female lead characters in the Hairdresser of Harare and the Edinburgh Night series. Did you find it very difficult, seeing that as you're a man? Did you find it very difficult writing characters of the opposite sex? And why did you choose these women to be your protagonists?
Well, here we go. I should start off by saying my mother was a woman. So, so I've encountered this rare species before. and if the statisticians are correct, then they make up more than half the population anyway. But so with some of these things, after you write stuff, you can rationalize it and say, I did it because of A, B, C. But part of it, when you get a character like Ropa, she was zingy. It actually started as a short story that I did in 2015 for an e-zine called Electric Spec. And I had this interesting character with a zingy voice that I thought I would want to work with again because they were so compelling for me. But when it comes to writing female characters, the problem that I always get is, you know, if you interact with women, you know they're all so radically different. It's the same with men. So you can't have this archetype of this is woman. And when you do it, right, if I started thinking woman, I would default to my stereotypes, of which I have a lot. You know, this is stuff you grow up and you absorb some of these ideas. I did the same thing with Priya, who's a character in a wheelchair. If I thought disabled, and I would just put in my stereotypes of what I think a disabled person is. So the way I do it, and I know certain writers like to research a lot and say, I've done research and this, but my starting point is character. So who is this person in front of me? Well, Ropa is highly intelligent. She's a problem solver, and she enjoys getting into problems and solving them. She's a leader. She's also fairly cautious because of sort of like her own family background and history. So I've got these personality traits with which I can work now. Now, if she kind of had the powers of Wonder Woman, she would solve problems differently. But in the book that I wrote, she's almost always the underdog. She comes up against magicians that are classically trained, that know magic much better than she does. So she has to have these creative solutions to these problems. And one of the things that she does is, in each book, she's always reading a work by a strategist. So in the first book, she was always referencing The Art of War. In the second book, it's the Book of Five Swords by Miyamoto. I hope I got that right. It would be very embarrassing if I didn't. In the third book that I'm working on now, she's using these ideas from Machiavelli. So it's her character that matters to me more than anything else. And then I try to think, from what I know about her, how would she handle this particular problem? I did the same thing with Priya. So in the first scene that I wrote Priya, she was in a wheelchair personality, so she's an adrenaline junkie, she's a thrill seeker, whereas Ropa might be a little bit more cautious. The two work together often. She is much more capable because she's studied magic, therefore she's more willing to get herself into situations that Ropa would kind of think, hang on, this might be a little bit too much for me. And that's kind of how I try to work it, because the other thing of saying I'm writing a woman, for me, it doesn't quite work, because you're then going to default to that stupid thing where you're like, she looked in the mirror and said, am I beautiful or not? Which male authors do.
Okay, so this is like my second to the last question, because I can see our time is going. So I want to talk about your style. There's something I always hear, find your style and stick with it. But in every book you've published, your style has always been different, your style of writing. So in The Hairdresser of Harare, you're right, it's more simple and like fast-paced, easy. Then we have the maestro, the magistrate, and the mathematician. This MMM, we have MMM, which is more like structurally complex. And then you give us the Edinburgh Night series where you write more wit and sarcasm. So do you think that writers should have a particular style they identify with? And do you intentionally change your style when you write a new book?
I always hesitate to prescribe anything to writers, because one of the things you quickly realize at some point, if you've been doing this long enough, is what works for someone else might not necessarily work for you. As a young male writer, I went through a slight kind of Tarantino phase, where I wanted to do stories with a high body count and snappy dialogue and stuff. I can't pull that stuff off even if I tried. It just doesn't work for me, but for someone else, it will work. So these changes or these discrepancies that you've noted between the different texts is me trying to find a solution to a particular problem. So you've got Wimbai, who's a young hairdresser who flunked out her O-levels, GCSEs, and went into the world of work. She's not a reader, she's not interested in that. She comes from a certain kind of community, so I have to at least try to style her in a certain way. With Ropa, who's an autodidact, who's also maybe a second or third generation migrant or child of migrants, she uses language in a different way from how I would use it. So Ropa's language has a lot of slang, a bit of Scots. She uses scientific terminology that I wouldn't use in ordinary dialogue and stuff like that. So part of the joy of, and doing this thing that we do, I have to say it's a lot of fun. I enjoy what I do, and I find it, and one of the best bits of working with Ropa was trying to figure out how this voice is going to work. So when you're in it and you're in that pocket and you're doing that work, you find something strange happens. Like if I go back to the emails that I was sending people during that period I was writing it, even my own style had changed because I was really in this voice and this thing that I was doing. And perhaps a few of my colleagues who I emailed would have said, this guy just sounds bizarre at the moment. Step forward to book 3, which I'm going into the edits for at the beginning of next month. One of the most difficult things for me, having done the first 2 books and taken a bit of a break, was getting back into that voice again, because I've got my own style and way of speaking, which is very different from this character. And until I managed to get myself back into that mode, it simply didn't work. I'm also working on this other project that I told you I might have to go back and revisit. And also one of the problems that I'm having with it is the tone of it and the sound of it. So with this, it's not me trying to flex and say, oh, I can do this or that, but it's really me trying to solve certain problems of how best can I convey this particular story.
So you mentioned you're bringing out your next book. It's in the editing phase. That's the 3rd book in the Edinburgh Night series, The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle. Okay, so what exactly should we expect from it? What are you giving to us? What's different?
So in the first 2 books, Ropa zooms all across Edinburgh, and she's got this huge canvas to work with. I wanted to do something different from the 3rd. The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle, there's a conference or an academic thing that the magicians are doing, and they hold it once every 2 years at this particular venue. So I wanted to write a country house mystery in which Ropa now doesn't have that bag of tricks that she has of, you know, when you run out of ideas, you're like, let's shift this to this other part of town. You've only got the castle and its knowledge of Edinburgh's history and that kind of thing. But I was moving her off to a setting and a location that she had never been to before. It was a way of trying to reconfigure the character, and that might also speak to why writing it was a little bit trickier than doing the first 2, because I then had to find ways of conveying information about this place that the character might not know about, and to find solutions to those problems. But book 3 for me also acts as kind of like a pause between the final 2 installments when they come. It's kind of a way of ratcheting up the stakes. So you're gonna have more villainous villains, ghosts, librarian gets murdered, there's Ethiopian magicians in attendance.
Stop giving us spoilers.
It's not a spoiler, I assure you. And a scroll gets stolen, and Ropa has to find out who done it under very difficult circumstances, because she doesn't know who to trust in that situation.
One of the things I really like about the books is the fact that you bring in this whodunit kind of idea into it. So it's kind of like reading crime in like a fantasy setting, which I obviously really love. I'm very excited for the 3rd book, and I really hope that when you guys actually read it, you love Ropa as much as I do, and probably you dye your hair green as well and wear boots and start wearing black. Okay, so we're going to move into Q&A from the audience. So does anybody have a question? Just one question? Just one question. Does anybody have a question?
I think we've safely put them to sleep.
Does anybody have a question? Okay, if nobody has, what? Oh, somebody has a question. He's over there.
Hi. Wow, this is loud. Okay. Hi, my name is Edwin.
Can't hear you.
Hi, my name is Edwin. I wanted to ask about supernatural occurrences and what Tendai believes about them. Does he believe they actually happen? Does he believe it's just science or EMP? Oh. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so supernatural occurrences, what do you believe about them? Do you think they're real? Do you think they are, fiction, science? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm naturally a skeptic. I mean, our mind has this ability to create scenarios and things that we believe. I mean, if you think about it, we're all in this room, but we're probably having 30, 40, 50 different experiences because of this gray meat inside of our heads. We're not experiencing this thing in a universal way. And so when I think about supernatural occurrences, I did an event at a school in Preston Pans just last week. And I asked these kids whether they believe in ghosts, and they were telling me fantastical stories. Like one was like, yeah, my granddad died, and in our house, his cane is always moving locations, you know. And they kind of live with it. They're like, oh yeah, it's granddad has moved his cane again, that kind of thing. So, yeah, what do you do with that when a kid is telling you that and they genuinely believe that there's this phenomena that's going on? But what I always find out about these things is whenever you try to test them and say, if you put a camera there, you'll never see that cane move. You know, so if you have something and we can explain it, then I'll believe it. But for now, I choose to be skeptical because I hear all sorts of, I mean, you want to be a member of my family, man. The amount of crazy stuff that comes out is phenomenal. And if I believed all of it, yeah, I would be nuts as well.
Thank you very much, Tendai. I think we're actually, I want to get your hand, basically. Oh, there's another question. Okay, someone else. Oh, just one. Okay, so we're done. Okay, I'm so sorry. You can see Tendai after the class.
And the boots are on.
Thank you very much. Please give them another Ake round of applause. It's okay, I'm going to flip this picture. So, moving on to the next panel discussion. Thank you, folks. It's now time to listen to a panel that will be hosted by one of the co-founders of Book Bunk in Kenya, and that is Miss Angela Washuka. Is she here? Oh yes, there she is. You hopping you in your little red shorts. I'm wearing red shorts tomorrow. Nothing's gonna stop me. And for the speakers on this panel, Sean, don't let me fight you. I cannot compete with that music. You know how much I like the sound of my voice. So, we have a publisher, author, our author, architect, Miss Hadiza El-Rufai. And all the way from Ghana, doing incredible things with Ake Books. Join me in welcoming Ms. Amma Datson. And last but not the least, somebody's lost their phone. Is it yours? Can you just check? That phone you put in your pocket, is it still there? Just check. Okay, if anybody is looking for a phone, please come and talk to me. Thank you very much, Chibuka. And a notebook as well. Thank you. And if you know anything about books in Nigeria, then you've heard of Roving Heights. They're doing incredible things all over the country. Revolutionized book buying for us, for the public. Please join Adedoto Enyade.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. Very much looking forward to hearing from our wonderful panelists this afternoon. And I think in the Ake tradition of this year, we're going to jump right in. In the festival program, if you'd like to find out more about the work that our panelists are doing, you're very welcome to read their bios and find out more about their work that way. So we'll jump right in. So this afternoon, we are speaking about the challenges that our panelists have encountered in terms of providing access to writing in general. And they'll also be highlighting some new developments in their work that they're saying. And I think we'll also be talking, obviously, about the effect of the last few years of the pandemic, business models. What's that looking like? What changes are we seeing? And I will start with my extreme right, Ate Dotun, who came up to me this afternoon, by the way, and said hello in Kiswahili. Very, very impressive. So you get to go first for that. So Ade, if I can call you that, I remember a few years ago, it must have been around a decade ago, I was having a conversation with a Nigerian publisher, Egosai Masuen. He was in Nairobi at the time for a festival. Festivals make the world go round. They're an economy of themselves. And he was a bit frustrated. We were talking specifically about post offices and the collapse of post offices. And again, this was probably 10, 12 years ago. So perhaps not as relevant today. And his view at the time that he was sharing with me was that to be a publisher or a book distributor also meant building entire systems of infrastructure. And in relation to that, there's someone who's a pretty big deal in the tech world who's from Kenya. Her name is Ori Okolo. And she has spoken in the past about the fact that we cannot entrepreneur our way out of broken systems. Now, you have stores in Lagos and Abuja. As far as I understand, Roving Heights is a popular destination for book buyers. And someone in this audience this afternoon described you as a Nigerian rising to a Nigerian problem. Do you think the problem you're tackling is universal or specific to Nigeria in terms of distribution of work?
Thank you very much, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to express my profound appreciation to Lola for inviting me to talk about my work, and also to learn from everybody who's in the book space. So to your question, Angela, I think distribution is not a problem that is peculiar to Nigeria. I think it's an African problem. And I say this because I've had the privilege of living and working in East Africa, Tanzania, and I guess that explains where I could, speak a smattering of Kiswahili. So yeah.
I'll take it.
So I imagine living in Dar es Salaam and, wanting to buy a book from, say, what's the name of that bookstore, Sleepway in Dar es Salaam, and then you're in somewhere in, let me think of, you're in Arusha or in some remote village. It will take you perhaps maybe twice the price of the book to be able to get it to wherever you are. And I think it's a challenge that everyone who's interested in, who works in the book space, they encounter every time, right? So someone is in Benue State, so let me think of a small town in Benue like Boko in north central Nigeria, and you're a big fan of, Lola Shone's books of writings, and you want to buy The Secret Lives of Baba Segi's wife. The price of the book is 2,500 naira, and just so you can wrap your head around, say that's about $5-6. And if you place a call to Roving Heights or you order it on our website, it will probably take 2,500 naira to get that book delivered to you in Benue. So imagine buying a $10 book and spending $10 to also get the book dispatched. And so that means you have to think of creative ways to be able to, one, bring down the costs of logistics of getting book down to the last mile, or figuring out creative ways to ensure that you don't have to spend that much money if out of your meager earnings you're fortunate to be a book lover and you want to buy a book every month. So you find publishers that are looking for avenues, you find bookstores that are looking for avenues to bring books closer to readers. And so I see people leveraging on infrastructure of chain supermarkets. So I see a publisher like Masobe Books, who's riding on the back of a chain pharmacy store in Nigeria, MedPlus. So I was in a med store outlet somewhere, in Abuja, and I said, oh, they have a stand where their books are, displayed, and you find, some other, bookstores or booksellers are exploring partnerships with cafes, with restaurants to say, you have these vacant spaces here, like, how about you put a shelf here, and then, so if someone calls and says, oh, I'm in Kaduna, and I want to buy a book, I can say, oh, why don't you go to Fasaha Cafe? There's a stand there where they also have a bookshelf, or there's a restaurant somewhere where you can. So I think it's a challenge, and, it's figuring out what's the best way, right? The post offices are there. I think that hopefully when they become more modern, when they become more responsive to, to the needs of the market that they're actually meant to serve, perhaps, the cost of getting books down to the last mile will come significantly, down. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll jump onto you, Amma. We've been having several conversations over the last few years around your business model, and the fact that Ake Books, which is Ghana's first publisher and digital distributor of African audiobooks, is definitely, it's the same business, it's built on different infrastructure. You're leveraging on technology a lot more, and obviously relying on audio storytelling as the format. What's been the uptake of this so far?
Hello, and very, very happy to be here. Thank you, Lola. This is my first Ake, so I am just so delighted to be here. So, audiobooks. Just taking on from what Dotun says about Africa being such a massive continent, and just the physical difficulty of getting books from one continent to another. You hear just even the discoverability. How do you know who's writing science fiction in Cameroon, who's writing romance in Nigeria, who's writing historical fiction in Ghana? It's just so very difficult to get answers to these things. I wanted to build a platform where discoverability of African books would be a lot easier, and I wanted to build it using devices that everybody carries around already. I mean, everybody in the room here has a mobile phone, I'm really sure. And I think, for me, publishers would understand that the potential to transform a mobile phone into a digital library of books would open up so many opportunities for access to books. So I started my business with audio, in particular because my mother was a writer and she lost her sight about 20 years ago. So the physical book was not, was not an option for her. She said she was too old to learn Braille, and so audiobooks became her life. We started listening to audiobooks from the days of books on tape to now, of course, it was DVD, then it's become streaming audio. She subscribed to several audiobook services, but we found out very soon that the African books were not available. So I'll be talking about a new book. Mom couldn't listen to it, and I started to think about, I come from a technology background, why aren't we having more audiobooks? Africans are wonderful storytellers. We come from an oral tradition. We have wonderful voices. And what I realized also from listening to audiobooks was that a lot of the Africans who do publish their books in the West, because now the digital publishing scene is very much multifaceted. When someone releases a book, they release it in all its formats, print, ebook, and audio. That's not happening so much on the continent. But when Africans publish with Western publishers, they have their books interpreted and read by Americans or Europeans or the country that they published in. Sometimes that doesn't give a very authentic experience. And in the audiobook publishing world, people love listening to their own accents, their own narrators, their own storytellers, telling stories in their own languages. So I started my service primarily first as a service for getting blind and visually impaired people access to books. But fast forward, audio has become a major commercial platform. Podcasting is on the rise, especially during the period of COVID when a lot of people were stuck at home, tired of watching TV. A lot of people started tuning into listening. And so during that time, the uptake of our platform really increased. The reach, we grew by word of mouth. We have a small platform, a small catalog of about 100 books. We are both a publisher and a platform, so it takes time to sort of work those two business models. But a recent partnership with MTN through their Ayoba African app has really helped us to reach a lot of customers. We joined MTN's Ayoba platform in March, and since that time, we've had about 160,000 subscribers to our platform. However, that platform is free. It's free data, zero-rated content. I think that plays a huge part in uptake. Cost of data is a big factor in accessing digital books, but I still believe that it's a huge potential to get people access to books. We will be relaunching our platform in December. It will include audiobooks and a catalog of books from around the world, African books, not only produced on the continent, but some of the books that we've been longing to listen to, but we are restricted because they are locked in on Audible or platforms that are not accessible to the Africans on the continent. And we're looking to have a platform that we can monetize and get some of those 180,000 people who've been listening for free, are enjoying audiobooks. It will come the test to see whether they're ready to pay for those audiobooks.
Thank you. And thank you for highlighting that. Obviously, we have a lot of writers in the room, and I'm not going to wait to get to the Q&A part because I know this will be a burning question around free access to the content. From what you've explained, it sounds like it's a little bit of a freemium model where you get people signed up, they're on the platform, they're consuming content, and then the idea is that you monetize a little further down the road. Could we talk a little bit more about that model and perhaps address, with the writers in mind?
That's right. The idea right now is just to build the audiobook listening community. It's in ESTV, Roku TV. A lot of streaming services are very popular among the young people, which is our target place. But audiobooks is new. So the idea is let's give people a taste of audiobooks. So we have excerpts from books, one or two full-length audiobooks, so mostly excerpts, a couple of chapters, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. If it's smaller books, if the publishers are agreeable, we do free content, and the interest is there. So the idea is grow the community and the user base, get them hooked, interested and excited about audiobooks. And then when we launch our platform, our current platform is really small. Our new platform will have about 5,000 books. We're getting titles from Recorded Books, WF House, Hachette Audio. We're trying to sign on publishers who have African either authored or narrated books in their catalogs and bring them into our platform, and then we will monetize. We're going to have a subscription-based, a credit-based model starting from $2, which will give you one book a month, up to $9, which will give you 4 audiobooks, which we believe will be a fairly affordable model for people to get started. So there'll be something for everyone. We will have some free books also within the catalog, and we always have free content for people to listen to. We are also expanding our narrator base. We really, and would like to talk to that a little bit later on about the whole audiobook production place? How do we get narrators? We're looking for top quality narrators and storytellers to work with us. Yeah.
Wonderful. And maybe we can provide you with some quick data, because data is queen. Let's call it queen. I don't know how many people are audiobook consumers consistently. Okay. That's a fair amount. Are we consuming via Spotify? Audible? Okay, Audible is a popular one. I see. Okay, there you go. But there's your market research.
Yep.
So I think on the same platforms, I believe our core books is available both on Android and iOS.
And internet. It's web-based as
Boom.
well. Mm-hmm.
There you go. So definitely worth checking out, and we'll talk a little bit more when we come back around about languages and what sort of languages you're producing the content in. We're going to move to a different part of the conversation when it comes to access. And your work has been very fascinating to look at, I have to say, quite close to my heart in the sense that, like the work we're doing in Nairobi with Book Bank, you're also looking at libraries, you're looking at communities of people, you're working with marginalized voices, so definitely looking at that segment of people in terms of access and focusing on that. You wear many hats. I believe you own a publishing house, you're a writer yourself, and you're also an editor. With your foundation, specifically with Yasmin El Rufai, you're providing access to arts and culture in general in northern Nigeria. And I was also informed that you're educating young girls and women, re-educating them who've been married without an education. You're re-educating them for about a year, teaching them to read and write. What role do these opportunities play in leveling the field, in your view?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I'm really glad to be here. And like the others have mentioned, I'm grateful to Lola for inviting me. Well, about my foundation, it's true. We have two key goals. We encourage young people to enhance their creative writing abilities. And also, we work with young women who have not had the opportunity to further their studies. Especially in the North, many women drop out of school, some due to early marriage, and there's so many other factors as well, including a lack of funds. The families always prefer to educate the men rather than the women who will be married off and go somewhere else. So what we do is we work with these women, and we find that they are really very interested in enhancing their literacy skills. And our belief is that once you give somebody that literacy, in the world of today, you've opened doors for that person as long as the person is not lazy. Because at the end of the literacy program, we also give them computer training. So our belief is that once you are able to access information on the internet, which is free, information is now basically free, they can learn whatever they need to learn, rather than organizing women and saying, okay, we'll teach them how to make soap. Once we give them that ability to research themselves, they'll be able to do that. Because when you go to YouTube, you see how to do so many things. And as for the younger people, we organize competitions for them and give them workshops. And we have a mentorship program where we match them with mentors to work with them. It's actually as a result of that I decided to start a publishing company, because we realized that a lot of our young people in the North are very, very talented, but for some reason, it's like they are not seen. So I started this company, Almara, with a particular goal in mind, which is to bring out voices from underrepresented people and also to bring out stories that are not known. You know, we are one Nigeria, but we all know that we have different cultures in the different regions, and I have to say that what most people know about Nigeria, especially globally, is from southern Nigerian perspective. Meanwhile, there are so many stories that I would like to tell that come from up north. So this thing is mainly about, we want to encourage our writers, not just northern writers, as long as you have a story that is coming from the north, we want to encourage them by giving them access to publishing. And so far, we have a website that we've called for entries, and probably because we're not that well known, we haven't had so many entries yet. I think the problem with not having northern voices or northern stories so much represented, especially globally, has to do with the fact that I think sometimes our own writers do not have the audacity, or whatever I should say, to send in their works to other publishing companies. So I believe that they might feel more confident in sending works to a publisher that they know they can relate to. And also there's the fact that sometimes the best person that can assess your work is somebody that knows the context of where you're coming from. Because some stories, if the person assessing has no idea, you might not find it interesting. So this is just, what I'm trying to do is just to give access to a wider, a wider group of writers so that there will be better inclusiveness and our underrepresented stories can be heard globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So you're talking about more representation, which is wonderful. Something that you said, I'm assuming, did you say that you are getting new content by doing public call-outs? You'll be doing public call-outs, correct? Okay, thank you. Another thing I've been thinking about in terms of access in this conversation has been around, I think there are a few pandemic novels in the room, or short stories. There must, yes. I'm looking at you, 10. There were, during the lockdown, that whole time, it was really interesting to see the role that social media played in connecting all of us, but also in creating new marketplaces for writing, and just general kind of distribution of words, you know, across the continent, outside this continent itself. So let's talk about social media for a bit. One of the sharp areas that was, one of the sharp areas of focus out of this pandemic was a kind of the digital divide between different strata of society, which is in itself a reflection of realities, barriers in the physical world. How has being active on social media propelled business for Roving Heights for you, Ade?
Thanks, Angela. So one thing that is worth putting out there quickly is the fact that we started out as an online bookstore. We started out, selling books via Instagram. So people would send us DMs, and I remember when we started out, there was social media as more people were signing up on Instagram, and more people were getting on Twitter and on Facebook. People became more comfortable with the idea of like, oh yeah, they've posted this book on Instagram, and then people are talking about these kinds of books, and then growing communities like the Bookstagrammers that have helped, books do well. And I think the whole TikTok thing is even a separate conversation on itself, even way before TikTok became the rage. So we started out being an Instagram, bookseller, and then we realized that people wanted to have, come into physical spaces where they could touch the book, and also having a physical space also sort of helped us with legitimacy, knowing that you're not just another faceless business that I'm going to pay and then you disappear, for whatever reason. So I think that, and I see the same thing in other parts of the continent as well, right? Lowe Books in Kenya. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Lowe, Lolwe in Kisumu, in Kenya. They're also an online store, and you find, some in other parts of the continent as well where people are writing on the tools of social media to be able to promote books. So I think it's something that has helped a great deal to give books one visibility. More people, as more people are signing up on Instagram, on Twitter, more books are getting visibility. So off the back of, hashtags, books have sold hundreds, in some cases thousands, because someone has, written a book and bookstagrammers are talking up the books. So we're seeing a rise in book sales on the back of that. And during the pandemic as well, when people were at home, for us, the challenge then was people are ordering books because they're at home. How do we figure out how to get these books, to them? So I think that the social media platforms will continue to drive trends, positive trends. As and some people might have expressed pessimism that people are spending so much time on social media, and so it's going to kill interest in books and reading. But what we're starting to see is that these platforms are actually driving more interest in books. You find whole communities around, like, on Instagram, you find, TikTokers. When we go for book fairs internationally, you get, catalogs that are, talking about the books. These are the books that are doing well on Instagram or on TikTok, I beg your pardon. And I think it represents an opportunity for those in the publishing space to see how can we leverage this trend to also drive more interest in books. How can we use these numbers, the numbers that we see? So when we post books on our social media handles, we're very heavy on analytics. We go back and see how many people downloaded those books to say, I'm going to add to my to-be-read books, or how many people are, are interacting and engaging with the post. Those are like really good proxies for us as to how those books will sell. So if I post a book on Instagram and maybe 4 or 5 likes and nobody downloaded the book, it tells me like maybe there's something about how people are connecting or how this particular work is going to be perceived. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything on social media, Alma?
Yes, just like Doton said, I think social media has become a crucial part of the whole book lovers network, the community of people who read, who share about the books they're reading, and a lot of followers. I think they're called book talkers, right? Book talk. And just recently, Penguin Random House has had a partnership with some of the book talkers who are bringing many, many readers to their platforms. Ake Books doesn't have a TikTok account at the moment. We are mostly on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, because I thought, audio doesn't really fit in with some of these platforms. But I began to take another look at it, and I'm looking for African book talkers who might be able to talk about the books in audio format, who might help us to share their excitement about a particular book. And it's quite exciting. We're looking at, in the next few months, if we can get a few people, young people, to help us drive readership and interest in books on those platforms. Someone's pointing to one. Wow, that's exciting. During COVID for us, it was a time where we focused a lot on children's books and early literacy programs. Ghana government did a lot on radio to support early literacy. And those radio programs were broadcast like Monday to Friday, and it was just teaching, because that 2-year period really disrupted, early primary school readers who were learning to read. So they did a radio series, but the thing with the series was they broadcast it once, I think they did a second repeat, and then that was it. If you missed it, you wouldn't be able to get the audio recording again. So we were able to go to government and say, look, we have an audio hosting platform. Why can't we'll be happy to host it for you so that parents can have it on demand. Some children just need to hear a lesson a few times before they can get it. And also the convenience of being able to listen with your child, because during that time, a lot of parents were looking for, ways to earn some money because they were not working or they were laid off. And so having a platform where we could host audio so that children could listen was really important. And we use social media to help broadcast about those, and it was very successful.
Okay, so book talkers need to sidebar Ama. Yeah, I see a collaboration cooking here. This morning when Professor Howard French was talking about, he was talking about very many things, but one of the things that he said was that Nigeria is looking at propelling towards 850 million people in terms of population. And I was thinking about just the sheer amount of languages that are spoken here and the sheer amount of marketplace as well. Ama, for you, on Ake Books, what languages are people listening to audiobooks in? What's popular? What's popping?
Mostly English, sadly, because English is a dominant language of publishing. But definitely for me, I'm really passionate about the possibility of listening to audio stories in many other languages. But the challenges are a lot of publishers aren't publishing in our local languages. We have a few Ghanaian language storybooks on our platform. We have languages, we have Tree, we have Ga, but that's about it. And we're looking at how can we get more. Because the dominant language of publishing is English, then it's difficult to have access to the materials. And then when we get those materials, then we'll have to have access to narrators who can read the stories in those languages. And it's been quite interesting. We did a project for, what do you call that? It was a company that was doing social financial services, and they had a financial literacy course for women, low literacy level women. They did an audio financial literacy course, teaching women how to use their mobile phones to, save, make payments, and do other things. And they wanted that series done in 6 Ghanaian languages. So we had to have it was written in English, we had to have it translated and find readers to do it. And it was quite a challenge, especially for the northern languages in Ghana, to find readers who could read fluently financial terminology and, make it readable. So I think in terms of translation, straight from English into Ghanaian languages or into African languages, there'll be a challenge. I'm looking to see authors who will write first in the local language straight away. So it's not a question of you're translating from English into local languages. And I think that will make for a more fluent read and make it much more enjoyable. But we are really open to all languages. My vision is to have Ake Books as a pan-African platform. All the African languages, you can listen to books in whatever language you want. Yes.
Thank you. Is it the same for you with languages, with Amara Books? Are you looking at English or English and others?
Actually, we're just looking at English. As you mentioned, you know, there's a huge challenge we face in Africa and even in Nigeria when you talk about publishing in our local languages. For instance, in Nigeria alone, we have close to 300 different languages. So I think that's publishing in English language. I just want to add one thing. We're a new publishing company, and since we started, we've just been thinking about traditional publishing, but having come to this festival, which is one of the gains of coming to such festivals, I am beginning to get another idea because of we have a long history of oral storytelling. Therefore, I think it would be a good idea. We could, you know, change our text to an oral reading so that we can have the kind of audio books. I haven't thought about that before, but I think it's a good idea. And at the same time, we can also, you know, change audio. We can have people that want to tell their stories that are not necessarily writers come and tell us their story, and we can transcribe that into text. I think that is something that we should consider. So, you know, I like working with young people, but unfortunately, I can be quite old-fashioned. I like to read the book. I like e-books, but I have never really listened to a whole audio book. But I think it might not be such a bad idea, and now that we're talking about it, I will start.
I was going to ask you what the future looks like, but I think you've described it beautifully. And now we should open up to the floor in case there are any questions from the audience. I see a hand, Blessing Musariri at the back. Mike is coming to you. There you go.
Oh, I'm just interested in terms of the future of the platforms that you're using. Because I was just thinking, my sister has been following, I don't know whether it's Bookstack or one of those apps where she says she's following the serialization of a story, and she says, you know, the writing isn't good, but the story is very engaging, and she stays on it because she wants to hear how it ends. And I was just thinking in terms of social media and things like that, especially in terms of audiobooks, and the idea that somebody could tell a story. Our traditional storytelling is oral. Is there no interest in having stories told, like somebody who wants to tell a story and then serializing it? Because I think that's something that people would be really interested to follow, especially people who can't read and they want to listen to a story, especially, you know, there's stories that are really there are people who can tell a story so sensationally that you will have a whole nation hooked on it. And I think this is something that, you know, should be explored, and I don't know if any of you would be thinking along those lines.
Are any of you thinking along those lines? Thank you, Blessing. And that reminds me about a kind of similar model on, I don't know how many people are listening to Serial, but I was hooked. I was hooked on Serial, which is exactly the model that you're describing. I think there's a huge potential market for those kind of models, and anyone who's in publishing and definitely thinking about leveraging technology should be thinking about the possibilities in that direction.
I absolutely agree with you. However, Ake Books only works with published writers, and the reason that we do that, and there's this whole interesting thing about is oral superior to written text and so on. But what I find is that we're not a full editing publishing house. And so when we work with people who are just doing, you know, manuscripts straight to audio, the whole editing, crafting the story, we don't have the resources to, you know, to produce it properly, because an engaging serial has to be well written. And I find a lot of people, spoken word artists, just think that it's just, you know, saying some stuff, recording it, and that's a captivating story. There needs to be an editing process. So a published book has already gone through that process. However, I do love the idea. Audible has this thing called Audible Originals. They have people who write for that format. They get experienced writers who write for that straight into audio format. We would love to see writers who would be interested in that kind of format. I don't think it's as simple as just having anybody come and record a story and it will be captivating. I think there'll be quite a lot of work to craft it and to make it a, you know, a fully fledged, ready to go story. So we work with published work that has already gone through that process. But I really do love the idea of, you know, ready to go into audio. And one of the really most interesting things I listened to last year was interactive audio stories, where you can listen to a story on Alexa and interact with the story. So you can, you know, you listen to part of the narrative and then it pauses and it asks you a question. You can branch to many different, you know, choose the direction in which the story goes, which I found really exciting. And I think it's very similar to our African style of storytelling, especially with folk tales. It's very interactive. And a storyteller can change the story depending on the audience. And I thought that was really exciting. I'd love to see writers who would be interested in writing that genre and creating audio. So I think there's a lot of interesting experiences around audio that we would like to tap in and build and continue to get our exciting stories out there to everyone.
That sounds like an open field for another area of collaboration. They keep streaming in. Let's go. We have another question. We have a hand up. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chisu. I wanted to ask, concerning book distribution, how do you guys navigate, say, piracy? Because I think piracy affects both book distributors and also the authors who write them. Because if more of your books are being pirated than the actual ones that were distributed by the legitimate publishing house are being sold, then both the authors and the books, maybe the booksellers might also be patronizing the pirated copies as well. So it might not even be affecting the booksellers as much as it's doing the authors. So it's possible, yeah. So I wanted to ask, how do you navigate these things? How do you pick and choose between pirated books and original ones? Do you just buy all of them and sell and say, okay, we are making money from all of them and stuff like that? Thank you.
I think you should take that one. Are booksellers colluding with
pirates? That's a very interesting, question. I think, just so you know, piracy is not peculiar to, to the continent. It's a global problem, right? And I think that the role of the bookseller in helping to tackle the problem is one of ensuring that the books are sourced directly